Okay, the first question is recently there was the Ubud Writers Festival, and the movie The Look of Silence also should have been shown, but it was cancelled by the government. And what do you think about it? How's your reactions and feelings? Are you sad? What?
Well, of course, I'm sad if Indonesians are forbidden by the government to watch either of my films. And I see what happened at Ubud as a kind of, as unfortunately part of a broader crackdown on freedom of speech that we've seen in Indonesia, especially since the 30th of September, the 1st of October, which was the 50th anniversary of the start of the genocide. There's been a kind of backlash from the military. We've seen a number of unpleasant things happen. There was a screening of The Look of Silence scheduled at the Jakarta Theological Seminary for the 30th of September, and from early morning, police officers started to come, initially saying they were there to watch the film. But by the time it was time to show the film, 70 officers had arrived and said, "We're sorry, we have had threats that the film reports threats that the film will be disrupted and attacked. The screening will be attacked by Front Pembela Islam, kind of right-wing paramilitary group, not unlike the Pemuda Pancasila, which is in the center of the act of killing. And so we cannot allow you to go ahead with the screening." They canceled the screening. But meanwhile, just 1 kilometer away, the Jakarta chief of police for all of Jakarta was introducing a screening of the government propaganda film, Pengkhianatan G30 SPKI, that was shown, a 4-hour propaganda film that was shown in schools every year as a mandatory thing since throughout the second half of the Suharto dictatorship. And this screening that was being introduced by the head of the Jakarta police was hosted by Front Pembela Islam, by this very same paramilitary group. So the paramilitary group was threatening our screening, or the Jakarta Theological Seminary screening, while hosting its own screening with the support of the police of an anti-communist or a pro-killer, really, propaganda film. And then a few days later, the Swedish, a man named Tom Ilyas, who was studying abroad in 1965, he was on a scholarship from the Sukarno government. He was studying abroad and was seen, therefore, as likely to be loyal to the Sukarno regime, the Sukarno government, and was therefore had his citizenship taken away and not allowed to return to Indonesia. And his father, because of Tom's scholarship, his father was killed in a mass grave during the genocide. And Tom eventually found sanctuary in Sweden and became a Swedish citizen and went back to Indonesia to see where his father had died, having lived a life of terrible guilt because his father had been murdered, he felt, in part because of his own studies abroad. And he went to the mass grave, found the mass grave, and was trying to approach the mass grave and take video footage of it to show to his family, his children back home in Sweden. And he was arrested, deported, and blacklisted. So he's never allowed to return to Indonesia. He is Indonesian, and he can't go back to Indonesia. And then, of course, there was the cancellation at Ubud, and there was a magazine called Lentera that had an issue dedicated to 1965. The magazine was confiscated by the police, and all the issues were burned. So I think it's a very frightening moment where there's this backlash from the military and the shadow state of paramilitary groups and military intelligence bodies around the military against freedom of speech. It appears on the surface to be a rise of a kind of neo-anti-communism. But of course there aren't any communists left in Indonesia. And what this really is I don't think this is a rise of anti-communist sentiment. This is the military asserting its power. It's a return, or an attempt to return, to state terrorism, to intimidate the public into silence, so that the corruption, the wholesale plunder and looting of the national wealth by this shadow state and its business partners is not challenged. You see, the moment that the government says what happened in 1965 was indeed a crime against humanity, and the moment that the government admits that to students, the wealth and power of the perpetrators, their proteges, the oligarchs who've enriched themselves through their relationship to these feared perpetrators, all that wealth and power is acknowledged officially for what it is, which is the spoils of mass murder and torture. And nobody wants their wealth and power delegitimated all of a sudden and in that way. So I think we're looking at an attempt by the military and the shadow state around it to step up its state terrorism against the Indonesian people, to intimidate people into silence, and to remilitarize the state. And I think part of the reason the military has been doing this is because there's that the president is seen as sort of anti-military, or has been at least defined that way, and he's weak. So actually the military maybe felt more secure when SBY was president, the previous president, who was an army general before he became president. Now I think the military is flexing its muscles and trying to assert its power. And it's a frightening moment we find in Indonesia.
Hi. Okay, hi. I have more or less two questions. One question is about your relationship with the protagonists of Act of Killing, with the perpetrators. How long did you shoot the whole film, and how was your relationship, your emotions, your attitudes towards them, and how did it change over time? And my second question is about the second film. About the victim, we saw a couple of scenes where he was like openly intimidated. How did you deal with it, and how did he deal with this?
In the Act of Killing, I filmed with Anwar and his friends over a 5-year period. I didn't film with them continuously. I would film for maybe 2, 3, 4 months at a time, and then return home to London, where I was living through most of the shooting, and then Copenhagen, where I live now, to sort of work through the footage that I had and figure out what I needed to shoot next, and sometimes to raise more money so I could return and shoot more. And over time, Anwar and I became very close. And when Anwar saw the finished film, the complete Act of Killing, and the uncut version of the film, which you saw, I think, yesterday, or today, Anwar said, this film shows what it is like to be me. And although it was painful for him, he was tearful, but he said, I'm relieved to have finally been able to show what these events have meant to me. And in terms of my relationship, it was difficult. I mean, the scene where Anwar butchers the teddy bear in the film, in the middle of the scene, Anwar had to stop the action because he noticed that I was crying behind the camera. And he asked me, what should we do, Joshua? You're crying. And I said, well, I think we should continue. And I really, in a way, regret that decision, or did for a long time, because I went home that night and had horrible nightmares, and then insomnia, and then nightmares and insomnia. I have insomnia because I was afraid of the nightmares. And that went on for about 8 months. I think I made a decision early on that to take very seriously something that's obvious to many people in Germany, which is that every perpetrator of every atrocity in our history has been a human being like us. And simply making a film where we condemn the atrocities is not the same as dealing with it, not the same as understanding or even trying to understand how human beings do this. And more to the point, with the Act of Killing, what the film's really about, how do human beings, having done this, live with it? And then what lies do they tell and impose upon the whole society if they are never held to account? And what are the consequences of that? And trying to understand all of that involved treating them as human beings. And every time I felt sort of hatred or the desire to condemn them as monsters, I would stop and take a break and pull myself together, sometimes for a day, sometimes for a weekend, sometimes for longer, and then return when I could once again approach Anwar as a human being. And Anwar and I care about each other a great deal. It's been a long journey we've taken together, and an important one, I think. For both of us, transformative for both of us. And so I don't think that we're friends exactly, but we have real care and even love for each other. And to answer your second question about The Look of Silence, first of all, it's important to say that it was Adi who first, it was first Adi who in 2003 encouraged me to film the perpetrators. And after Ari and the other survivors who he'd gathered to work with me back in 2003 were threatened by the army not to participate in the film, they called me to a kind of midnight meeting in Ari's parents' home and said, please don't give up, try to film the perpetrators. And that led to the act of killing and led to 7 years of my working with the perpetrators. I filmed with the perpetrators you see in The Look of Silence in the old footage for 2 years before I met Anwar. And then I met Anwar and started making the act of killing for 5 years. And I went back to Indonesia to shoot The Look of... And Adi, throughout that 7-year period, would watch everything I had time to show him. And when I returned to Indonesia in 2012, it was after editing The Act of Killing, but before anyone had seen it, before it had had any screenings, because I knew once it screens, I wouldn't safely be able to return to Indonesia at all. So I went back in 2012, and I sat down with Adi to talk about what we might do for the second film. And he said, I've spent 7 years watching your footage with the perpetrators. It's changed me. I need to meet them, particularly the men who killed my brother. And I said immediately, absolutely not, because it's too dangerous. There's never before been a film where survivors confront perpetrators who still are in power. We cannot, and for obvious reasons, because it's dangerous, we can't do it. And Adi then said, let me explain why this matters to me so much. And he went and he got this small video camera I'd given him after I finished shooting The Act of Killing to use as a kind of notebook to look for images that might inspire the making of The Look of Silence, which I knew I would return to make, although I didn't know it would involve these confrontations. And he'd been sending me tapes while I was editing The Act of Killing. And he said, there's one tape I never sent you because it's very personal to me. And he put it in the camera and said, I want you to see it now. And on the little flip screen of the camera, he pressed play and we watched the one scene in The Look of Silence that Adi shot. And as soon as the image appeared on the screen, Adi started to cry. And it's the scene of Adi's father crawling through the house at the end of the film, lost and calling for help, thinking he's in someone else's home. And Adi, through his tears, said this was the first day my father couldn't remember anyone in the family. And we were trying to comfort him all day, but we couldn't, because whenever we went close to him, he would panic, or whenever we had to touch him, because he's deaf and blind, we had to touch him, and when we would do that, he would shriek with fear. And so we would try and then wait and try and wait. And it was unbearable for me, he said, to just do nothing and sit by him while he was calling for help. So I started to film. And as soon as he said I started to film, I realized, he said, that I was documenting. The reason I wanted to film is because this is the day it becomes too late for my father to heal, he said. You see, he said, my father has forgotten the son whose murder destroyed our family's life and his life, but he has not forgotten the fear. And now he'll never forget the fear. He'll never work through the fear. He'll never be able to heal because he can't even remember what happened. And we watched the scene play out. And then finally he said to me, you see, I don't want my children to die in that same prison of fear that my father and millions of other survivors will die in. And I think if I visit the perpetrators and show that I see them as human beings, that I'm willing to forgive them if they can only acknowledge what they've done is wrong, then the perpetrators will welcome this as a chance to be forgiven by their neighbors, by their victims' families. And my children will then grow up no longer afraid of the neighbors the way we have been. And they'll have a future with less fear, without fear. And I was very moved by this. And I went and talked to my Indonesian crew, and they pointed out, because no one's seen The Act of Killing yet, and because the making of The Act of Killing was famous or well known across this region, because the vice president, the national paramilitary leaders were involved. Everybody believes you're close to the most powerful men in the country. And these men Adi wants to confront are only regionally powerful, not nationally powerful, and they won't dare detain you, let alone physically attack you. So we think you can confront them safely. They might threaten you, they might get very angry, but we don't actually think they'll do anything. So I then went and told Adi, look, we have to be prepared to stop this at any point if we sense there's real risk. We have to tell your wife and your mother what we're doing before we take any risk and make sure they agree. And in fact, the scene in the film where they where they disagree and when they say you shouldn't do this, that was shot earlier than it appears in the film. That was shot right after the very first confrontation with Inong, whom Adi never tells. Adi never says that his brother was killed to Inong. So we really hadn't risked anything there. And then we showed it to his mother, to his wife, and they responded, as you see. And then Adi showed them the scene with Inong, and they realized that this could be very important, and asked, "Is there a way of doing this safely?" And we explained that we think so, but we took all sorts of precautions. The family was waiting at the airport, ready to evacuate during each of the subsequent confrontations, if anything went wrong. We had a whole. We had. And also we had to be prepared not just to stop during the shooting, but I told Adi we may not be able to release this film if we can't find a way of doing it safely, that the whole family is comfortable with. And then I said, and if you can agree to all of that, I also have to warn you that I don't think you will get the apology that you're hoping for. I think you're coming to them and seeing them as human beings won't be something that they welcome. It'll make it harder for them because they'll have to return your gaze and see you as a human being. And consequently, they'll see Ramli as a human being, and they'll be forced to see all of their victims as human beings. And in that moment, all of the lies that they've told themselves justifying what they've done will fall into crisis, will come falling down, and they'll panic. They'll look into your humanizing gaze and see their own conscience, and they'll panic. But of course, when they were threatening Adi, I was, although we had we were planning to we had plans to evacuate the family, and there was a getaway car, so Adi could get away would leave the location as soon as we finished shooting, while the rest of us were unpacking the equipment. Of course, we were scared. I mean, these are powerful men who are capable of violence, and I think they didn't dare ultimately commit violence or attack us because of what they believed to be my connections to their superiors for making the act of killing, but we were scared. It was physically, it was a very frightening film to make. And it's interesting you asked those two questions, because the act of killing was emotionally frightening, but rarely was it physically frightening, because the government was rolling out a red carpet for everything we were doing with the perpetrators. But the look of silence was physically frightening, but actually for me, very emotionally healing.
I've heard that The Look of Silence was shown in Jakarta to an audience. What were the reactions of the society?
The Look of Silence has screened many times. It's screened over 4,000 times in Indonesia, publicly. Most of those screenings were public. And the audience from the feedback we get from people who organize screenings, is approximately 350,000 people have attended screenings. So a lot of Indonesians have seen the film in theaters or in screenings, and the film will soon be available online for free, and that number will reach tens of millions, or millions, or if not tens of millions, which is what happened also with the act of killing. The act of killing really opened the way, I think, for The Look of Silence. So the act of killing helped catalyze. It wasn't solely responsible for this by any means, but it helped catalyze a kind of fundamental change in the way the media and the public talk about the killings, where before there was silence, with very few exceptions, there was silence from the media, or even the celebration of the genocide as this heroic extermination of the Indonesian left. Now the media talks about the killings as a crime against humanity and the criminal regime that the perpetrators have built. And into that space opened by the act of killing, The Look of Silence has sort of helped Indonesians acknowledge something that they all, I think, are aware of, but haven't been able to talk about comfortably before, which is the prison of fear in which everyone is essentially condemned to raise their families. And so the reaction has been what you would expect, increased calls for truth, justice, and reconciliation. Adi, the film was called the Film of the Year in the media last year, across much of the Indonesian media last year, when they do their end-of-year lists where they name what the best film of the year was. Much of the Indonesian media chose The Look of Silence. And Adi was seen came to the Jakarta premiere, which was held in Indonesia's largest theater and was sponsored by two government bodies, the National Human Rights Commission and the Jakarta Arts Council. Something, I should say, unimaginable with the act of killing, which began its life in secret. Here it was distributed, in a sense, by two government bodies, The Look of Silence. It was held in a venue for 1,500 people. 3,000 people turned up because there were billboards around Jakarta announcing the screening. They put on 2 screenings so that everybody could see the film. And Adi came to the first or second screening and received this amazing ovation from the audience. And then trending on Twitter that day, it was National Heroes Day, a holiday in Indonesia. That was just a coincidence, but trending on Twitter in Indonesia and therefore around the world, because Indonesia is the world's largest Twitter-using country, was today we have a new national hero and his name is Adi Rukun. So the reaction was very positive, but at the same time, because it was so positive and because the film had such was screened so widely, that provoked this backlash, I think, in part from the military, which has basically been the pattern of paramilitary groups threatening to attack screenings. They're hired by the military or the police, I'm sure, to do that. And then the military or police use that as an excuse to demand that screenings be canceled. And also, the military and the police have, this never happened with The Act of Killing, but this film became big enough that the police pressured the film censorship board to ban the film for commercial cinema screenings. So the film is actually banned for screening in cinemas the way it came out in Germany.
There's another question.
Yes, what I wanted to ask is, has the military or the people in power somehow become nervous? So this backlash, is it an impact, a result, a consequence of the wide distribution of the film, and has it apparently set something in motion in the Indonesian society, and then is the military nervous or perhaps even panicking somehow?
I don't know if, I'm not inside their head, so I don't know if they're panicking, but I think that definitely it is a backlash from the military. I think part of it is, as I said earlier, not really related to the film. It's because there's a civilian president who has promised, at least as part of his campaign, to address human rights violations, and he's not trusted by the military, and he's also weak politically, and the military's flexing its muscles and taking advantage of his weakness. That may not have to do with the film, but I think certainly the basic backlash we're seeing against freedom of expression around 1965 per se is a backlash against something that I do think has been set in motion, in part by these two films, that is, I think, also unstoppable. I mean, I think both of my films in different ways have come to Indonesia like The Child in the Emperor's New Clothes. And if you think of it, The Child in the Emperor's New Clothes points at the king and says, look, the king is naked, but everybody knew the king was naked. They just were too afraid to say it. And if The Act of Killing is pointed out, look, of course mass murder is wrong. And even if many people in the younger generation are not aware of what happened, they know something terrible happened, and that lying about it and holding out the specter, the frightening ghost of what happened, is the basis of a regime of fear in which these men in the military and their business partners are able to loot and plunder the country with impunity. And that, I think, is something that The Act of Killing pointed out that people knew. At the same time as it also, insofar as it fleshed out a picture of what happened in 1965 by focusing in a very small way on one pixel, one death squad in a much bigger picture, it piqued the curiosity of a younger generation as to what happened, and that's set in motion a kind of process of discovery and questioning that was already there but has grown, and has also found wider and more public forums for its expression, because it's one thing to have that questioning and that exploration in smaller private forums. It's another thing when it's filling special editions of national news magazines, which happened as a result of The Act of Killing. And then The Look of Silence, as I also said, has come in and also, like The Child in the Emperor's New Clothes, pointed out this thing everyone knows but couldn't talk about comfortably, namely the abyss of fear and guilt dividing everybody in this country and imprisoning people, and ensuring that and this, the way that, in the sense that the past is a kind of open wound that's used as a threat. You see, in the Look of Silence, we hear again and again, let the past be past. But survivors always are saying it out of fear, and perpetrators are always saying it as a threat, meaning the past isn't past. It's right there keeping people afraid. It's empowering perpetrators to threaten, and it's keeping the survivors terrified. And I think pointing that out has pointing these two things out that people knew has done just what the child in The Emperor's New Clothes does. It's intervening in a kind of cognitive dissonance that is essential for the functioning of the status quo. When people know something but can't talk about it and need to even pretend that it's not there, that's the fundamental mechanism of this regime of fear. And by intervening in that, it does set in motion, the whole system sort of goes haywire, to use a fun American word. And it starts to break down and people start questioning. And I do think it's unstoppable. Of course, a show of force from the army will push some people back into silence, but I think these films are out there. They're available for all to see online. There's no stopping them. There's millions of copies of The Act of Killing in circulation, even if they were to censor it on the internet. And the same for The Look of Silence very soon. I think that there is no turning back. I think that there will be a struggle to get a national acknowledgement because, as I said earlier, people don't want their power and wealth delegitimated and revealed to be the spoils of mass murder and plunder.
Do you have some more time left?
I think I have time for one more question. Sure.
One more question? Okay.
We can even do two more if there's still more interest.
Hi, thanks very much for two amazing films. My question was, I saw an interview after I saw The Act of Killing, and in it you stated that there was an Indonesia before the act of killing and in Indonesia after the act of killing, and that it's kind of had this, clearly had a major impact. And I'm just wondering if you know about other artists who have, or how it's being dealt with, and how are people taking it up and dealing with it, and how safe are they? Like how is that faring? Do you know? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think first of all, I appreciate that, but I think I must have been quoting the National Human Rights Commission, because I think I would be.
I'm sorry, I might have misquoted you. I'm sorry.
But no, I just wouldn't. But I think that, or maybe I was quoted. It was in Tempo magazine, that quote. It was the review in Tempo magazine when they published a double edition on the film. I think there's a lot of writers, and quite a number of them had some space at the Frankfurt Book Fair to talk about their work. I'll say a story that I haven't really said in Germany, but I'm pretty certain is true, so I may as well just go out on a limb and say it, which was that the Frankfurt Book Fair asked me to come, or assumed I should be part of the Indonesian program. And one of the problems, and I think this is a problem that writers trying to address and artists trying to address the 1965 genocide and what it means for present-day Indonesia, something they face in Indonesia. I had a meeting when I was doing press for The Look of Silence with Adi Rukun in Germany, and we were in Frankfurt, and they came to talk to us and say, well, we'll surely want you here at the Frankfurt Book Fair. And in the end, the Indonesian committee didn't want me to come. And so I didn't come to Frankfurt, but I understand that, and the man who didn't want, the people in the committee are people who will talk about 1965 as something that needs to be dealt with, but they talk about it in a kind of way that also says we need to also contextualize this as part of the Cold War and talk about what the communists would have done to society if they hadn't been killed. And I see that discussion as something that is maybe interesting as a kind of historical counterfactual speculation, even if many of the victims weren't communist and the Indonesian Communist Party wasn't armed and so forth. But it also is the beginning of a slippery slope where you start justifying genocide. And this is because the intellectual gatekeepers, this includes many publishers, newspaper editors, magazine editors, the intellectual gatekeepers in Indonesia are from a generation of people who who built their careers during the Suharto dictatorship, and the older ones who were apologists for the genocide while it was taking place, and only came to criticize the Suharto dictatorship later. And so that's a barrier of access that really pioneering work faces in Indonesia. But I think there's tremendous work being done by writers. There's it's harder in film because there's such strong censorship, and now the Film Censorship Board, which has been moved to be under the ministry, under the Defense Committee in the Indonesian Parliament. I mean, imagine if the film censor is not under the Culture Committee, but under the Defense part of Parliament. The Film Censorship Board in Indonesia now has a new plan, which was just leaked, that they want to start censoring films from production, from script stage. So it's harder for filmmakers, but certainly there's been theater performances and music and books and memoirs trying to address this issue. I think the other thing that's hard, and maybe one of the reasons why the Act of Killing never had quite as big a release in Indonesia as the Look of Silence, is that it's hard to talk about the present day. It's hard to talk about what I think both of my films are really about, which is present day impunity and present day thuggery. And this regime, the Indonesian military is formally above the law. If a military officer orders an entire village massacred, they cannot be put on trial in civilian courts unless the military, and the only way such a military officer could face justice is if Parliament were to convene a special human rights court, something they've never done fairly or effectively, or if the military itself were to say, we want to try this person in a military tribunal. And when the military, the institution with the monopoly on violence in a society, is above the law, then of course they are the law, ultimately. And in every conflict between the military and the civilian government, really since Suharto fell, in terms of real issues over impunity and human rights, the military has.
We've lost you, or you've frozen.
That continues to be a problem. Have I lost you? You've frozen. You're still there. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. You're back
okay.
Again.
So there's shadow state, as I talked about, around the military, which sort of exercises ultimate sovereignty or veto over the civilian elected state. And I think that this is hard for people to talk about. So the Act of Killing probably, the media would talk very often about the Act of Killing as like exposing what happened in 1965, but was hesitant to talk about how Yusuf Kala, the vice president of the country, is seen saying we need our gangsters to beat people up so we can get things done, or the corruption that it exposes, or the role of paramilitaries in politics that it exposes, and the role of fear that it exposes. Because I think that's dangerous, because that's the present, because that threatens present day interests. And I think that's something that Indonesian writers and artists have been slower to address, in part because it is more dangerous. And it's the reason why I think Indonesians couldn't have made these two films, and why my own crew, who really did make the film with me, remain anonymous, because they would be killed or probably killed, is my honest belief, if an Indonesian director had openly made these two films.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now there would be the last question.
Sure.
Hi, Joshua.
Hi.
I'm Indonesian, and it's more like a comment, perhaps. I don't know how many times you've heard this, like probably a million times, but I grew up in Suharto's era, where I think maybe I can speak on behalf of other Indonesian, especially the youth one, where we never skip a year, where we watch the Gate 30 SPKI.
That's the propaganda film in the Act of Killing.
Depiction, where they depict the 6 generals got killed, slaughtered, and everything. So it became, at that time, at least when I grew up, I feel like it's internalized, like as Indonesian, how it's, for us, it's more like it's something that had been done. It's just something that we had to do at that time, that we always have in mind. So for me, your work, it's more...
You mean watching the film or...
The G30 SPKI, the movie that they play to just commemorating the event. And so for me, your work is like an opening eye for me, in a sense that now even between me and my friends, we discuss, we debate on how it was actually happened, what was happening back then, that it's still taboo for us to talk about it among Indonesians. I mean, we don't really know what's going on at the time. And second of all, probably it's more like it's political. How do you see like the U.S. government position, given the fact that Suharto was having close relation and having a lot of influence from the U.S. Government? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your very kind comment, and I'm so glad the film has meant that to you and your friends. And I'm very happy you asked about the U.S. government, because it was the last thing I wanted to say in response to the first part of your question. You see, when you ask yourself with your friends what was Indonesia's, what really happened back then, and when you discuss that, it's worth recognizing that Adam Malik, who became vice president under Suharto later on, he had received from the U.S. Lists of thousands of names of public figures during the killings whom the U.S. wanted killed. And these were journalists, politicians, trade union leaders, leaders of the Indonesian women's movement, but 5,000 names basically were given to Adam Malik to hand over to Suharto with the understanding that that the military would go down the list, tick off the names as they killed them, and give the list back to Robert Martins at the U.S. Embassy, who created the list, when they were done. And Adam Malik was a CIA officer, and it's well documented, a CIA agent, and it's well documented that when he was vice president, he was still an active CIA agent. So when you have the Indonesian right and the military talking about how it's foreigners stirring up this 1965 question in Indonesia, it's worth considering that the new order, that the Suharto dictatorship's own vice president, one of them at least, was an active CIA agent. Imagine if Vice President Biden in the United States was a secret agent of the Badan Intelijen Negara, the Indonesian intelligence services. It would be pretty shocking for Americans to learn. Or if that's a little bit strange because America is not a superpower, what if a former vice president, or because Indonesia is not a superpower, what if the former vice president had been a Soviet agent? That would also be really shocking for an American to learn. So the 1965 genocide is not just Indonesian history, it's American history, it's British history, it's Australian history, it's probably Japanese history. It may even be German history. I mean, we know that the United States gave weapons, these death lists that I just told you about, money. We know that the US created propaganda that incited Indonesians to not just kill communists, incited the army not just to kill communists, but also the ethnic Chinese, in an effort to drive a wedge between the new Indonesian government that was forming under Suharto and Beijing, which was communist but had split already from the Soviet Union. And just for that reason alone, 50,000 ethnic Chinese were killed, on top of the hundreds of thousands of non-Chinese Indonesians who were killed. And we also know that, as you saw in The Look of Silence, that not only did death squad leaders feel that they were inspired to kill and maybe even taught to kill by the United States, we see that Goodyear, a major multinational corporation, was harvesting the latex that goes into its tires and into our condoms, using slaves taken from death camps, just exactly as German corporations were doing on the periphery of Auschwitz only 20 years earlier. But German radio, because there wasn't yet television at the time, German radio was not celebrating slave labor taken from a death camp as a kind of victory for the German people. It was just happening sort of secretly and discreetly, whereas American television was celebrating this as a victory for freedom and democracy. And this should lead all of us to wonder to what extent was US participation in the genocide really undertaken on behalf of the struggle of the so-called free world against the communist world. To what extent was it motivated by ideological anti-communism? And to what extent was it really just an excuse for to what extent was ideological anti-communism really just an excuse for murderous corporate plunder? And when I was in Cologne, actually, just a few weeks ago, I had a meeting with the person who runs the Cologne, or one of the founders of the Cologne Film and TV Festival, and he told me that he'd written a book about an SS officer who was commanding Einsatzgruppen SS, who were in the east, massacring Jews across what is now Poland and Ukraine. And after the war, he hid out in the West German intelligence services and was sent when Germany started to reassess its Nazi past, or even before that, actually, in the early 60s. He felt that the denazification, that he felt that he was maybe going to be arrested, or his handlers in West German intelligence did, and they sent him to Indonesia. And this war criminal, who presided over the murder of tens of thousands of Jews, became a very close friend of Suharto and supported Suharto throughout his rise to power. That's what this German academic professor told me in Cologne. And so it's worth asking to what extent also is this West German history, and therefore German history, the 1965 killings. And in the US, we have we're working with senators in the U.S. Senate to get a resolution that's now in the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee onto the Senate floor and then passed, that would demand that the United States acknowledge its role in these crimes and declassify all of the documents detailing the American role in these crimes and take responsibility for that. In part because we know that if the U.S. would do that, and if there were an end to silence in the United States, that would probably make it easier for the Indonesian government to do the same, and at least it would be leverage for Indonesian human rights activists to say, look, America's acknowledging its role, can't we do that? You see, so long as we only criticize other countries' human rights records and yet remain silent and hide our own human rights violations, human rights will correctly be seen as a hypocritical ruse for U.S. commercial and strategic interests. So it's very important that the silence ends in the U.S. and across the Western world. The whole West celebrated the 1965 genocide when it happened, and much of the West participated.
Okay, Joshua, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
We enjoyed the discussion with you.